Every ship that transits the Panama Canal uses 52 million gallons of fresh water. In 2023, the rain failed. Daily transits collapsed from 36 to 18. In 2023, rainfall in central Panama collapsed. Within months, the largest locked canal on Earth, built specifically to use the rain that falls on the surrounding watershed, could no longer move the ships it was designed for. Each ship that transits the Panama Canal uses about 52 million gallons of fresh water. Almost all of it comes from one reservoir, Gatun Lake. When the lake fell during the worst drought in the canal's modern history, the Panama Canal Authority had to cut daily transits from a normal capacity of around 36 to 38 ships, down into the low 20s. Some restrictions reached as low as 18 ships per day in early 2024. By early 2026, the rain had returned. Gatun Lake hit maximum operating levels. The Canal Authority opened the spillways for the first time in years to release excess water. Then, in May, NOAA forecast that El Nino conditions would likely return by mid-year, raising the risk that the canal's water regime would tighten again. The Canal Authority said it was not planning new restrictions through year-end. This episode is about a choke point where the geography is fixed, but the rainfall the engineering depends on is not. The Panama Canal works because of a continental divide. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are roughly the same level. The land between them, at the narrowest point of the Isthmus of Panama, rises to about 85 feet above sea level. To move a ship from one ocean to the other, you have to lift it 85 feet, move it across the divide, then lower it back down. The way the canal does that is with locks, chambers that fill with water to raise ships, then drain to lower them. The water comes from above. Fresh water, fed by rainfall, stored in lakes higher than the locks themselves. The lakes are the engineering insight. Gatun Lake is artificial, created in 1913 during the canal's original construction by damming the Chagres River. The lake covers about 420 square kilometers and stores roughly 5.2 cubic kilometers of water, enough volume to operate the locks under normal rainfall conditions. A smaller reservoir, Lake Alajuela, supplements it. Together, these lakes feed the lock chambers that raise and lower ships. Every transit drains some of that stored water out to sea. About 52 million gallons per transit, equivalent to roughly 200 million liters. Approximately 6% of global maritime trade transits the canal each year, depending on how the metric is calculated. The Canal Authority uses figures between 5 and 6%. The route is essential for the Asia to U.S. East Coast container trade, U.S. Gulf to Asia LNG exports, and intra-American trade between U.S. East and West Coast ports. In 2023, the rains failed. The dry season, normally December through April, extended longer than usual. The wet season, May through November, brought less rain than the watershed needed. By mid-year, Gatun Lake was running visibly low. By the end of 2023, lake levels were hovering around 80 feet, far below the typical 88 feet at the end of a wet season. The Panama Canal Authority, which manages the canal's water budget, faced a choice: reduce daily transits to preserve water or maintain transit volume and risk running the locks dry. They chose to reduce transits. By November of 2023, daily transits had been cut from the normal 36 to 38, down to 24. By February of 2024, with the lake still dropping, the Canal Authority cut further, announcing restrictions as low as 18 daily transits. Container vessels, which normally draft 50 feet, were restricted to 44 feet, meaning less cargo, lighter loads, more trips per ton shipped. The total throughput crashed. Container shipping through the canal fell to fewer than 250 vessels per month, down from 300 to 330 in normal conditions. Liquefied natural gas transits collapsed more severely, by some estimates, 73% below pre-drought levels. The world's shipping schedule started rerouting. The reroute was the Cape of Good Hope. Ships destined for the U.S. East Coast from Asia could no longer wait in queue for the canal. At peak congestion, ships were waiting weeks for a transit slot. They sailed south instead, around the southern tip of Africa, then up the Atlantic. The detour added roughly 3 weeks to each voyage and burned hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional fuel per ship per trip. The cost was absorbed initially by carriers, then passed through to consumers via shipping rates. The effects rippled into every supply chain that depends on Asia to U.S. East trade, which is to say, most of them. In 2024, the rain returned. The El Nino that had driven the worst of the drought weakened. La Niña conditions, typically associated with more rainfall in Central America, set in. By August of 2024, Gatun Lake had recovered enough that the Canal Authority restored normal operations with full 50-foot draft for Neopanamax vessels. By early 2026, the lake had reached maximum operating capacity. The authority opened the spillways, the controlled discharge gates at the Gatun Dam, releasing excess water for the first time in years. The fiscal recovery followed. The Canal Authority reported that fiscal year 2025 revenue reached $5.7 billion, up 14.4% year-over-year. Total transits reached 13,404, a 19.3% increase from the drought-impacted prior year. The shipping schedule began returning to normal patterns, but LNG transits remained roughly 73% below pre-drought levels. Shippers that had rerouted via Cape of Good Hope during the drought stayed on the Cape route because the additional voyage cost was lower than the cost of unreliable canal transit schedules. Then, in May of 2026, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center forecast that El Niño conditions would likely emerge again, with about an 82% probability between May and July of 2026, and continuing through the rest of the year. NOAA assesses the odds of a very strong El Niño event at roughly 25%. A strong El Niño typically suppresses rainfall in Central America. The Panama Canal Authority announced on May 15th that it was not planning new transit restrictions for the remainder of 2026, even if El Niño returned moderately. The condition for that statement was moderately. A strong El Niño changes the math. The canal does not just compete with the climate, it competes with Panama itself. Gatun Lake is not only the canal's water source, it is also the drinking water source for Panama City and Colón, two of the country's largest urban centers, where roughly half of Panama's population lives. As Panama's population has grown, the household water demand from Gatun Lake has grown with it. The Canal Authority has to balance commercial transit revenue against municipal water supply. During the 2023 drought, those two demands were in direct tension. Panama maintained drinking water as the priority. The shipping took the cuts. The other demand factor is the ships themselves. The canal was originally designed for a class of vessel that fit the original locks, Panamax. In 2016, after a decade-long expansion project, a new set of locks opened that could accommodate larger ships, Neopanamax. These vessels are bigger and heavier, and lock cycles for them require more water than the original Panamax cycles. The water-saving basins on the new locks recycle some of that water, but each Neopanamax transit still consumes meaningfully more than a Panamax transit did before 2016. The canal that moves modern global trade is, by design, more water-intensive than the canal of a generation ago. The Canal Authority has been studying reservoir expansion. building new dams and watersheds to add storage capacity for both the canal and the population. The largest proposal involves the Rio Indio watershed, which would significantly increase available water, but requires displacing communities and acquiring land. As of 2026, the project remains in planning. Whether it is built and on what timeline depends on Panamanian political will, environmental review, and the Canal Authority's ability to finance the construction without raising transit fees to a level that further drives traffic away from the canal. When the canal can't take a ship, or can take it only at additional cost, the question becomes where the ship goes instead. The primary alternative is the Cape of Good Hope. From Asia to the U.S. East Coast, the Cape route adds roughly 2 to 3 weeks of voyage time compared to a Panama transit. It adds substantial fuel cost, longer crew rotations, and additional insurance exposure. But the Cape route has one advantage during a choke point disruption. It is reliable. It does not depend on lake levels, transit slot availability, or political negotiations. It is just longer. The other alternatives are partial. The Suez Canal handles Asia to Europe trade and parts of the Asia to U.S. East trade, but it has been constrained by Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping since late 2023. Mexico has launched the Interoceanic Corridor, a rail-based alternative across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, with ports on both Pacific and Atlantic coasts, designed specifically to capture containers that would otherwise transit the Panama Canal. The corridor became operational in 2023 and has been ramping container handling capacity since. It cannot replace the canal. Rail transshipment is fundamentally slower than direct vessel transit. But for select cargo flows, it offers a backup option that did not exist a decade ago. The Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic is being discussed, but remains marginal for commercial shipping. The climate projection makes the alternatives more important. A 2025 paper in Geophysical Research Letters by Munoz and colleagues used downscaled climate models to project Gatun Lake levels through the rest of the century under different emissions pathways. Under low emissions trajectories, the lake remains relatively stable. Under higher emissions trajectories, lake levels decline due to reduced wet season rainfall and increased evaporation. The historic lows of 2023 could become the new normal. The canal's 100-year-old engineering, designed for a stable rainfall regime, is operating in a regime that may no longer be stable. The Panama Canal is one of the most consequential pieces of infrastructure ever engineered. Its construction in the early 1900s reshaped global trade by collapsing a 3-month sea voyage around South America into a 1-day transit across an isthmus. The engineering insight was elegant. Use the rainfall that falls naturally on the continental divide to power the locks. The system worked for a century. It is now operating in a climate that the original engineers did not design for. The Canal Authority is adapting. It is restricting transits, releasing spillways, planning reservoirs, and negotiating water budgets between population and shipping. But the fundamental constraint, that the canal runs on rain, has not changed. The geography didn't change. The rainfall regime is becoming less reliable. Geography created the constraint. A narrow isthmus, a continental divide, a lake-fed lock system. The institutions that decide what happens inside that constraint, the Canal Authority, the Panamanian government, the global shipping companies, the insurance market, the NOAA climate forecasters, are now working in a regime where the underlying water budget is no longer fixed. This is the Hinterland.